Well, once again, thank you all so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here with such a great panel of speakers today. My name is Sarah Carter, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Data Science Institute in Galway, and I'm part of the SFI Research Center for Training in Digital Enhanced Reality. Today I'm going to talk to you about four-dimensional autonomy in a digital age, where privacy notices going wrong. Before I get in though, just briefly a little bit about me. I have a background in biochemistry and biomedical science, actually. I was trained as a scientist. Then I moved into bioethics. I got tired of working in the lab and wanted to try something different. And then from there now in my PhD, I moved into information and computer ethics and privacy. Oops, it's not letting me move my slide. Oh, like that, perfect. So it's pretty well documented that privacy notices have challenges when it comes to autonomy and free choice. Those of you that are in the EU have probably seen, since the GDPR was enacted in 2018, all those privacy notices popping up every time you open a web page asking for your consent to data collection, and it can get quite overwhelming. And you may have also noticed that these privacy notices don't have necessarily a lot of controls, that sometimes what's called dark patterns are used in the privacy notices, like highlighting the I agree or accept all. And then on the flip side, we also have what are called privacy nudges, which are design choices that are there in the, sorry, I just started my timer here to make sure I don't run over time, that these are design choices in the privacy notice that are there not to sort of encourage users to share more data, but actually to encourage users to be more protective of their data. And depending on which scholar you ask, some see these as helpful, others see them as manipulative or overly paternalistic, thus coming into conflict with autonomy. And then, as I alluded to earlier, for those of you in the EU, too many notices absolutely overwhelm a user, can cause notice fatigue, and can cause a lot of click-throughs and not really be representative of autonomy. So while we've sort of intuitively identified where privacy notices might be going wrong in terms of user autonomy, we struggle still to identify in what way or how autonomy is violated. And this makes it really difficult then to make design choices in privacy notices to actually preserve user autonomy and through identifying the issues, we would be able to then hopefully on a very pragmatic level, design privacy notices to better preserve a user autonomy. So in this vein, for my research, I've been using Suzy Killmister's four-dimensional theory of autonomy, which comes from her book in 2017, Taking the Measure of Autonomy, a four-dimensional theory of self-governance, where she maps the complex landscape of autonomy into four distinct dimensions. And one of the benefits of this theory is not only does it help identify where autonomy might be violated or might be undermined, but it also helps us see why or how it's happening. And the hope by using her theory is that I would be able to identify where privacy notices are going wrong in terms of autonomy and possibly propose some solutions on how to modify or fix them. So in Killmister's theory, we first have self-definition. And this is the internal aspect of autonomy. This is when an agent develops a cluster of commitments formed by their goals, beliefs, and values. Then if we move a step out from the internal world of the agent, we get to self-realization, which is practical deliberation to form an intention based on a collection of commitments, and also externally realizing or acting on this intention. Then Killmister has self-unification, which is looking at whether or not what one has committed to or self-defined is actually what they end up self-realizing. We all know people who, even maybe ourselves, who act in ways against their commitments or beliefs. And Killmister argues that this is an irrational way of undermining our own autonomy, hence the purpose of the self-unification aspect in her theory. And then if we move all the way out away from the agent, Killmister pulls in the idea of global autonomy, which she calls self-constitution. And this is the ability to take on new commitments, to modify our commitments and beliefs based on the world around us, and how that could be restricted or sort of enhanced depending on our environment. Yeah, so firstly, what I'm going to do is take a look at self-definition in the context of privacy notices. So the question to ask here is, do privacy notices as they exist now help a user develop a cluster of commitments formed by their goals, beliefs, and values? And before I get into this, I just want to note that I love chess, and I think that there's a lot of great analogies with privacy notices and autonomy that can be made with the game of chess. But for the interest of time, I'm not going to use that analogy. If you'd like to ask me about it later, I'd be happy to tell you. So going back to self-definition, at first glance, yes, it looks like privacy notices are helping with self-definition. They were originally put there to inform the user, this idea of the rational consumer, right, within a capitalist system. But as you get into the nitty-gritty and the practice, no, as I mentioned before, there's the phenomenon of notice fatigue. It's overwhelming. One study said it could take up to 224 hours a year to read every privacy policy and the notice that we encounter in 1 year. So this leads to just being overwhelmed, no reflection, just clicking through. 75% of users use actually the quick join accept all option. And in this way, notice fatigue prevents users from reflecting on or self-defining values and beliefs and goals about data collection practice. It's a very automated, mindless kind of endeavor. Now moving on to self-realization in the context of privacy notices. So the question that I asked here was, do privacy notices help a user act on their intentions? And in practice, once again, no. As I alluded to earlier, it's been stated that there's a lack of relevant controls in privacy notices. So online, most problematically, is the existence of the confirmation only notice, or the accept all or okay to cookies notice where it's not very easy to access alternatives. We've all seen these, and concerningly in 2019, a study showed that 68% of EU notices actually have this feature. And this, if you move off a line and into your smartphones, smartphone permissions that are available also don't align with what users are concerned about when it comes to data collection. So I'm talking like location, contacts, other kinds of data that apps may collect off and on, that it's not granular enough in order to allow users to express and realize their privacy concerns in line with their intentions. So yes, in this way, a lack of relevant or just privacy controls in general prevents users from realizing their relevant values and commitments around data collection practices. So now moving on to self-unification here, the question I ask is, do privacy notices help a user's actions align with their intentions? And no, we have the dark patterns and the nudges. As I mentioned briefly before, well, the main dark pattern that is used is pre-selecting the I agree, which absolutely increases consent, as was shown in 2019. And even if we wanted to add design choices to notices that would nudge a user in more privacy-preserving way, that this could violate self-unification. And this idea comes from Killmister herself in her 2017 book, where she states that nudges only support self-unification if it encourages the behavior the agent intended. And you can actually imagine instances where a user might want their data to be collected, where it might be consistent with their goals and values and commitments and beliefs to do so. For example, perhaps it's a healthcare app where collecting their data will go towards research. Perhaps the user is okay with using a new app that's a prototype that then the data would go into a kind of diagnostics kind of treatment. So you want to make sure that you're not paternalistically nudging all the time to privacy preserving behavior, because this might actually violate one of the dimensions of autonomy. So just to summarize, dark patterns and nudges in privacy notices affect users' abilities to unify or align their privacy actions online with their values and commitments towards data collection. Now, finally, we have self-constitution, or what some might see as global autonomy. And the question I asked here is, do privacy notices allow users to take on and modify their commitments around data collection practices based on new information or other environmental factors? And the answer is no. And this actually ties back into what I said firstly about notice fatigue and self-definition. it's overwhelming. We're not reflecting, we're just clicking through. It doesn't encourage us to read or learn new information or take in new information or educate ourselves or modify our commitments. So just like how notice fatigue can undermine self-definition, notice fatigue also prevents users from taking on new commitments around data collection practices. So as I mentioned before, my interest in applying Killmister's work to privacy notices is to try to improve them to better preserve user autonomy. So how might we fix these challenges in notice design? So on the notice fatigue side that prevents users from reflecting or self-defining based on their values and beliefs about data collection practices, we might consider reducing notice fatigue with selective and personalized notices based on a user's values, goals, and commitments. So instead of using blanket GDPR mandated pop-up notices on every single thing, leading to notice fatigue and overwhelmed and just basically apathy, we could imagine using notices in a selective manner in instances where a user's values, goals, and commitments might be undermined. And the technicalities of this, of course, are still being, will need to be worked out in years to come, but we could imagine perhaps having some kind of system or deploying notices in a way that the user's only getting the information relevant to them without becoming over fatigued and overwhelmed in situations where it might not be relevant. Moving on to the next concern, with the lack of relevant privacy controls and the difficulty that comes with then self-realizing as a user, these selective and personalized notices that I mentioned could also maybe contain a suggest alternatives button where you would click it and then it would link a user out to web pages or applications if you're in a smartphone in which the data collection practices of that web page or smartphone are more consistent with the user's values and beliefs and goals. So perhaps it's you're using a certain kind of banking application, and this one has data collection practices that undermine one of your values, say of privacy. Then this, what I envision would be a privacy notice that could suggest to you, hey, there's another banking app that does a similar thing that doesn't collect this one kind of data that you are particularly sensitive about. Again, this is still conceptually in the making, but you can envision that this kind of suggesting alternatives and providing another avenue, another choice for the user would definitely enhance their autonomy in this situation. Moving on to the dark patterns and nudges in privacy notices, which I think are some of the most disturbing aspects of privacy notice design that we're dealing with today, we could imagine that the selective and personalized notices aren't just there for the self-definition aspect of it, but also are sort of nudges in themselves. So instead of nudging within the design of the privacy notice, every time that you would get a notice, that is your nudge, that is your reminder that, hey, you're acting in a way that doesn't align with what you have defined before. You might want to reevaluate this. And sort of by applying friction selectively, slowing down people selectively, and hopefully in a way that doesn't overwhelm them, going back to self-definition, we could imagine increasing the likelihood that an agent would self-unify in these situations. And finally, moving on to how notice fatigue prevents users from taking on new commitments in terms of self-constitution and instances of global autonomy. Notices will also have to be dynamic in nature. So I've talked about how these notices are selective and personalized and only coming up when it's most relevant to the user. Now, the danger with that is that you will then silo the user in one time point when they felt a certain way or had certain values and goals and commitments. And you don't want that. We are by nature dynamic. And not to mention, I'm sure many of us would be surprised if we got all the privacy information and how our data is being used. So you want to make sure that you empower the agent with the ability to take on new commitments based on new information. So what I envision is, besides these selective and personalized notices, would be a couple of notices that would be deployed periodically to sort of mine the user's values and commitments. So if they would appear in instances where the user might have not specified them to be, but would be a way of reminding the user, hey, there are other data collection practices out there. And then the user can decide to modify their commitments or the beliefs or their goals based on this new information. So yeah, this is just a summary of the challenges: the notice fatigue, lack of relevant controls, dark patterns, and nudges. The dimensions that I identified were violated using Suzy Killmister's four-dimensional theory of autonomy, and then the possible solution. Instead of using blanket notices, using personalized, selective, yet to some extent dynamic notices that allow a user to change and develop different commitments over time. So in terms of future directions, I'm very interested in exploring a technology called personalized privacy assistants. Now, personalized privacy assistants are machine learning assistants that personalize and automate certain privacy choices for the user. Now, they already have to some extent the dynamic and personal and selective attributes that I'm after, but they still have some issues that are out of the scope of this talk. But my next step is to utilize this technology to capture the dynamic, personal, and selective attributes and optimize personalized privacy assistants to sort of achieve four-dimensionality autonomy in the context of privacy notices. So just very briefly here, because I know we're running behind on time, but I'd like to thank the Ends of Autonomy organizers, Monash and Warwick University for inviting me here. I'm excited to be here with philosophers and in an interdisciplinary setting as an applied ethicist. It's where I thrive. I'd also like to thank Matthew Descon, Heike Feltzman, Catherine Cormican, and Dave Lewis, my wonderful supervision team, and also D-Rail for funding me. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to our discussion and questions.